Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Thursday, and of course, with me, Chantel, your hostess, with the mostess, definitely, here on Aquarius, Rising Africa. And tonight, two amazing people who are no strangers on this channel, Jessie Czebotar and Dr. Dennis Carroll, who will be sharing information, stories, etc., on vampires and werewolves. And yeah, wow, looking forward to hear more about that. You all know I'm putting out a lot of information about these creatures of the night lately, but hey, let's do it. See what this is all about and what it's all about. Yay. But before we go any further, thank you so much, Laurie James, new member. Really appreciate you. Welcome to the Arrow Tribe. And I hope you enjoy what we're putting out there. So without any further ado, ta-da and ta-da. Welcome, Jessie. Welcome, Dr. Dennis. How are you guys doing? Nice to see you again.
Doing well.
Doing good, yeah.
Wow.
Been busy, very busy here lately. I did a show last night, and it's kind of related to this a little bit. I was talking about unaliving the undead on my show last night. Vampires are fascinating. Vampires and werewolves are my favorite actual subjects when it comes to the supernatural, definitely.
Yeah, it gets interesting. So I can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, well, as we know, Dr. Dennis is a right royal expert when it comes to obviously research and experience on folklore, and also an I want to say cop, but that sounds a bit rude almost, police officer, policeman. And also has had a lot of experience in the occult in that chapter of your life, Dennis, right? And then, of course, JCU, that's been part of the upper echelon of the system, if you want to call it that, and obviously knows quite a bit. And I know you've told us some stories in the past about werewolves and things as well.
Yeah.
And we've learned on this channel now, these things aren't just horror movies that get sucked out of thin air. It's very real. And yeah, very interesting. So welcome, everybody. Nice to see you all in the chats. Welcome. Hello, Joyful Janine. Really nice to see you all. Mama, Leanne. Yeah, welcome. And join in the chat. Love to hear your comments and where you're from. What do you think about these topics? It's amazing, actually, to see what's being unearthed right now. But Jess, I'm going to start with you. Ladies first, right? So maybe you want to just start by your experience, your knowledge about these mythical creatures of the night.
Yeah. Mythical, I think, is a tentative word. I think that there's enough experience and evidence to show out there that this does exist, that beyond just being a lifestyle, people may hear stories of, real vampires, those that suck blood versus, those that are energy vampires. Then we also hear, random stories about werewolves, and the question in our mind is, are they just myths or are they real? Are these creatures that do exist? And I would propose that they do exist. And I've talked about on prior shows, my personal experience with some of that with the protectors in the system. You have, ancient bloodlines that are born to serve the elite, to be a part of the protectors and the sovereign military in the system. Uh, they're selected around age 4.5 to age 5. Their first vow for those that are vampires or werewolves is at age 5, and they'll go through a Scottish York Rite ritual, usually around December 21st under a blue moon. And that's when they'll take, the first vow. They call it an unbreakable vow with the spirit. The spirit that they connect with is what's considered a changeling spirit. And these spirits are both, I would say, like their gifts are to be able to cause a delusion, to be able to psychologically impact the way people see things. But at the same time, they're also able to physically change the body of their host. And so, that first unbreakable vow is taken at age 5. I had one individual that had come out of the system, and he was explaining what had happened to him. He was a werewolf, and he was so bad, so bloodlusty, that the system actually paid a coven of witches in the area to bury him alive under 6 feet of cement and to wait there the week until he died. But what happened was, as he was down in the ground, the Lord literally appeared to him and began to give him all the scriptures and Old Testament that were proofs of the Messiah. And at the end of that, I think it was like 6 days, not quite the 7 days, as he describes it, literally the Lord took him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him up through all that cement. He came up proclaiming Jesus Christ, and the witches in that coven were so terrified that they came to Christ. And in all that, after hearing his testimony, I said, well, how did you get free from the unbreakable vow with this spirit? And he's like, I rebuked the spirit and cast it out in Jesus' name. And I was like, why did I not even think of that, So anyway, it shows the power of God in this, but it's very real. These people do exist, and even in our present day, are here among us at times. So
Yeah, it's interesting too, hearing a story like that, to realize that, some people want to take these things on. They want to become these things. It's part of the deep in black witchcraft or dark witchcraft that they attach with these things. And it is a spiritual thing that is being accomplished with that, definitely, without a doubt. But some people are victims to this, like you mentioned that about the bloodlines. Some people have this in there. It's a curse in their family, like it's passed down from generation to generation. They don't have a whole lot of control over that unless. And here's the interesting thing. I've had a lot of people come to me over the years saying, "Oh, I've got this in my bloodline. I've got, witchcraft. I've got, vampirism and all this stuff. What do I do to fight it?" And I said, well, the first thing you do is you don't embrace it. You resist it. Like you were talking about this guy. He did a 180-degree turn on that when confronted with it. And that's what you've got to do. That's what breaks these curses and agreements and contracts and all that stuff. That's the power of God. That's the only thing. I've had so many people come to me over the years saying, I've got a curse on me, I've got this on me and all that. What can I do? I've searched for years to find out what. I said, well, there's one very simple thing. The only solution to this is God. That's the only thing that's going to help you. And when you hear stories like you just told, that very well illustrates exactly what's happening here. So it's fascinating to think about. I have had my own run-ins with vampires and werewolves, and I'm going to put on my next book on the back of it. It's what you said here at the beginning. I got a little blurb on the back, and it says, when you're a child, you believe that monsters are real. Mm-hmm. Then you grow up to find out they really are. And unfortunately, the monsters are us most of the time. That's the way that goes. But when you hear stories like that, though, it's fascinating to think about that some people want to be in this state, exist in this state, and others, unfortunately, are victims of it. And that's the sad part about it, too. Yeah.
And I think the only enemy's control, how does the enemy get legal ground at all? It's through unrighteousness. That comes through, family lines that are going to be making contracts with these spirits, these entities, and even offering up their children to these spirits and entities. But there is, where's the hold? It's, the enemy wants us to believe that things are unbreakable, that once the contract's made, it can't be undone, that, once you give in, that you're bound forever to that entity. But that's all a lie. that's all part of the delusion and the oppression and the chains of wickedness that are binding people. The truth is that you can be free, and that you have the authority to rebuke and cast out these entities and break those contracts for your entire, generations that are coming in the future. We're not bound by those things. So, but when you begin to think about how the vampires and, the werewolves bind, like, what are some of the things, Dennis, that you've learned in your knowledge? Like, how do people get bound by these spirits, or how do they, how do these spirits work in operation when they begin to kind of lure or seek out, or how do they get people connected to their territories and then get that authority over them?
Well, like you laid out there, they, first of all, a lot of this is demonical lies. Like, these are lies that they give people, and to take their hope away from them, to take any kind of help away from them. And once you believe the lie and you embrace the lie, or however you go about that, you give it authority over you. That's the important thing we got to look at. And the Word of God teaches us that we should walk in authority. God, Christ, has given us authority over these things. And if we don't exercise that authority, then we are victims to, the bad guys. They definitely, and they don't want us to know that authority. As a matter of fact, they want to replace that authority with their authority.
Yeah.
That's how they work. And we've got to understand that is what they do, whether it's vampirism or werewolf or whatever the situation. And if you're, a high witch, and you know this, Jesse, that you can shapeshift to different things that you want to do. You have this power, and like you mentioned earlier, the power of glamour. They can get you to see what they want you to see, and all this. Yeah, these are the powers they seek with their authority. The authority that they embrace, the darkness. And here's the interesting thing, and I'll say this, and we got to remember this today while we're talking about this. When you take on these things, when you become and surrender to this darkness, okay, it will eat you up alive eventually. You know this as well. You become that darkness. And when you become that darkness, it consumes you completely. So if I were, say, a werewolf, and I go back to revert back to my human self or whatever I want to do in that respect, every time I do that, I lose more and more of my humanity. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing with the vampirism. The longer you remain a vampire, the more it changes you from human into something else, into the darkness. The same thing with being a werewolf or any of these powers that you take on. When you take these powers and you give them that authority, then you are really, basically, that's what you're doing, selling your soul, per se. That's what that entails, So we got to remember, you got two kind of authorities moving here. You've got the authority of God, which we should all be walking in and living and give us better lives. But if you go with the authority of darkness, it's going to do some bad stuff to you eventually, one way or the other.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, like, some of the things were coming to my mind of how people are kind of brought to that place of continuing to surrender things over to the darkness. And you'll physically see signs of these individuals as they begin to surrender. Usually first it starts like where they'll wear, necklaces with certain items or crystals or pentacles, certain signs on them. Then you'll start to see they'll physically begin to change their appearance, whether that's, darkening their hair. You'll see a lot of the painting of the fingernails. Sometimes you'll see tattooing images on the body. Yeah, the nose rings, the piercings is a huge one. Yeah. You'll get the really weird piercings. And again, it's not saying everybody who gets those things are into that or, are connected to spirits, but at the same time, you'll notice that there'll be like a darkening of the personality, and a lot of times it will come with drugs. It will come with certain invitations, like when I saw certain covens working in my area to draw people into vampirism, they would start having meetings every night. They would, they'd be offering forms of drugs. It would come, I think they use more drugs than alcohol, but the invitation for that, and then the sexual promiscuity, and there'll be you'll see a continual drawing into that. And that's how they'll get the young men usually is, you'll have a group of covens drawing them in. And it's really, some of our communities, like back in Green Bay, Wisconsin, they had a nightclub, we'll say, but it was like not your typical adult nightclub like you. This one, it was called The Option, and they actually invited, where teens would get in there and they would be given drugs to the teens. I had one young man that literally the Lord told me to go in and get him out. So I got a group of friends together and we went in there. We paid to get in there and tracked him down and drug him out of there. But you'll get a lot of them working with the nightclubs or the undergrounds to lure the kids in.
They own a lot of those places too, by the way. They are actually backing those places up. I find, Jesse, that's interesting that they recruit people. Like if we were going to recruit Chantel and we were, in a vampire cult or something, we would tell her, we want you to be our mother. We want you to come into the coven and be our mother and give her of life. In other words, we're going to use her as a blood deposit kind of. We would tell her, that's one way to go about it. You're going to be our mother in the coven. You're going to be our mother, or the giver of life. You're going to sustain us and all that. They come at this in so many different psychological ways on people. Yeah. And it is very much like, the Charles Manson cult kind of a thing. The family was, and very much like that. And it operates along, and as a police officer, I studied this. It operates along the lines of the different ways that cults draw people in and all that. And you're so right about that, because it's a tried and true formula, and they still use it. But I heard a story. I don't know if you heard about this story of a vampire nightclub in New Orleans that people say that is down in a certain alley, and a lot of times they go back to look to find it, and it's not there. Okay, but that there's supposed to be a lot of people that go into this club and never come back out. And according to the stories, that there is a drink in this club that they tell you never to drink, and it is called the second death. Have you ever heard of this? But, in the Bible, the second death is actually the absolute judgment of damnation. You don't come back from the second death, okay? I would never drink that, folks. Never drink anything off the second death. That's not a good idea. But I know you've probably heard stories about that, about these nightclubs in New Orleans. Yeah.
Well, that area, especially, you have high vampirism there. You'll have different areas where you'll have your vampires versus your werewolves, but New Orleans is a high area for the vampires. You have, Blavatsky and others that were in those areas. When you go there, they actually have bars too that you can go into. Like their whole downtown is kind of built like a square, and we went into tried to go into the Catholic church that was there, because what you have is they have a massive Catholic church. That church, the sanctuary, looks out into this open area, and then you'll see that whole square of downtown kind of situated behind it. Well, when we were down there, we found, George Eisman, that I do shows with too, he had a electromagnetic detector. And we heard the priests go in the sanctuary. They were singing, and we're like, well, why are things situated the way it is, where they're singing out the back, and back behind there was this Jesus statue. Well, the energy was so strong. It was like there was nothing electrical around there, yet his meter was going off the charts with the electromagnetic energy. we followed that stream from them singing at that Catholic church went about, I would say it was a good 3 miles. And as we followed it all the way to the end, it literally was going straight to a voodoo shop. We went in that voodoo shop. We're like, okay, what's in the voodoo shop that's drawing all this energy? And they had a massive statue of Baphomet in the voodoo shop. But this is kind of how that stronghold area is. The bars that they have with the vampires, they'll literally have posted all over the door all these signs about the dead. They've got all these coffins. One of our ladies, accidentally, she went in. It was the only place to get a drink, but she didn't know like that it had something else in it. But she thought she was just buying a water, and it wasn't just a water. And that was an interesting experience. We're like, why are you so loopy? And then we figured out it wasn't just a water. But that's,
Wow.
people don't even know, like they have things marked and you think you're just buying something simple. It's hot there. You go in and next thing you know, there's something else in it. And, this is part of how they could keep control in that area and so easily can get people captured and taken in and people disappear. And,
That goes on a lot with a lot of the dark witchcraft and stuff. We call them demon traps or devil traps. They set little things like that, little traps for people. They leave things like that in cemeteries for people to pick up and take home with them. I know you've heard of that. And these shops do that as well. They have a lot of things like that are left in these shops for people to buy or whatever. There's enough evil in the world without buying it and taking it home with you. Definitely not. But that's what they're up to a lot of these times. And a lot of these, and we'll get into that later, but a lot of these covens are networked. We got to understand that although you have segmented covens, you have satanic covens, you have satanic witch covens, you have werewolf covens, you have vampire covens, and yet they all have a network together. Although they do compete against each other, and they do have wars. You've heard of that, I'm sure. They do have wars once in a while. You never want to get caught in the middle of a witch war. Okay, definitely not. But here's an interesting thing. I want to ask you about it since we're talking about werewolves and clubs and stuff like that. I've heard many stories where actually werewolves have been used as assassins or hitmen from different covens against different covens. What do you think about that? That's interesting.
They do. And how I saw that in operation in Oregon. What they'll do is when they're doing trafficking, they like to, they'll have areas where they're going to do it out of. Usually it's going to be connected to your downtowns. They like to choose areas that are near theaters or places where you're going to have a lot of people coming in at night. This is part of why your movie theaters started having later night movies. And so on those nights, they'll have guys that will be bringing like smaller kids looking like they're, usually the kids like are around age, I'll say 9 to 11. So they'll actually come, like they'll have a man with these 2 kids. They'll buy a ticket into the movie. And then you'll see one of the kids disappear right away. And it's because they go and they'll open up the back door to the theater. A lot of times they'll have an abandoned building or a closed office building of some sort right next door. And they use that backdoor entrance in the theater for that kid to get through. And then they will let people in to the abandoned building. And that's how they get into the underground there for the rituals. The other kid is just meant to be a distraction. Usually, they'll say they're hungry or thirsty. They'll always be at the bar. They'll be in the bathroom, things like that. And that's part of the distraction. Well, when that was happening in our area, literally, like if you walk out, you'll see at that abandoned building, usually a guy in a leather trench coat, with their head down, a big hat of some sort to cover their face. they'll be smoking a cigarette, just looking like they're leaning against the building, smoking a cigarette. But that's your wolf. They're there to provide the perimeter protection, to make sure from the front end nobody's figuring out what they're doing, and to keep people away from that building. That's a lot of how they'll use those lone wolves. And you'll even get them, like I've brought out in my affidavits, how you'll get, when the military is trafficking children, you'll often see the military weapons displays in conjunction with your Highlander groups or your medieval festivals, and they'll coordinate so they're all moving through the same area at one time. Therefore, your military uses the wolves or the vampires that are with those medieval fairs or the Highland displays as the perimeter protections as they're in areas. They used to use the circus in that same way. But, if you watch for that, you can tell when they're coming through areas, there's a coordinated movement.
That's interesting you bring that up too. I've been doing a lot of research on the Werewolves of Ireland. They were called the Freela. They were a military sect of werewolves, actually, that worked for different lords and all that. They were like mercenaries, but they were kind of like good guys. In other words, they were kind of like knights, like the Knights of Old, but they were supposed to be werewolves. And, there are a lot of stories that the church, the Catholic Church, has employed, the hounds of God, as they were called, over the years. That's an interesting aspect of that, too. Do they have a sect of werewolves? And years ago, I was contacted by the CIA. And all they did end up asking me a bunch of demonology questions. And it made me wonder, why do you need to know that? Why are you asking me these things? Have you been messing around with that? And that's the conclusion I came to. But he said something very interesting at the end of the interview. He asked me, he said, would you like to work for us? Would you like to come work for us and work with us? We are looking for people with supernatural talents. And I'm thinking, who else do you have employed with you? Definitely, without a doubt. And I'm glad you brought that up about the military, because I know without a doubt the governments of the world are very good at weaponizing things. And the vampire and the werewolf would be definitely weapons they would never pass up. Absolutely.
Yeah. They do use them and even, train, breed. They breed children with those from those family lines to bring in as the protectors. And you're right, you have a dark side and a light side. You have those that believe that they're only doing, what's good, that they use their abilities, their powers, their connections for the betterment of humanity. And you'll get them working, they'll keep that constant equilibrium between the dark and the light, where the dark's always coming in, causing destruction, chaos, death, mayhem. And then you have the light side coming in, doing the cleanup. You'll have them doing the ritual preparations for the areas, the perimeter protections. Sometimes you'll even have them, where they'll have smaller towns or cities, that the elite are going to be coming through, but they believe that what they're doing on the light side is, that whatever sacrifices, whatever contracts that they make are to protect their city, to protect the people in there, to protect their families. And they really see it as a good thing. And you'll have the vamps and the wolves kind of providing that perimeter protection, even, doing the preparation, the cleanup, all of that in those areas.
And they're also, I think, they have a job of participating in the ritual aspects of a lot of this, and I did a show with on Chantel not too long ago about how they use children in these different things. They have the Feast of Blood, the vampires have the Feast of Blood, the werewolves have their feast, and so on and so on. The different little ceremonies like the Red Wedding that they have and the Red Hunt. And all these different things that they do with participate with children. And that's a big part of it. A lot of these children that disappear into these things are used for those purposes and for breeding purposes as well. depending on their bloodlines. Absolutely. And if you're deep into this stuff and you have a child and you're part of the bloodline thing, that would be considered a sacrifice in a way for you to give your child to this for the breeding purposes or whatever the situation. They consider that an honor in some ways to be able to do these things. I've had people come to me over the years. I had a young lady come to me and said, I have a familiar spirit. I have a demon buddy because my father gave me the Satan when I was born. He was in deep into this stuff, and he, dedicated me to the devil and all that. And said, and I came into this. She felt like, without a doubt, she had an obligation to fulfill what her father started and all that stuff. This is very sad in many ways because they are, especially to tell a child like that in their childhood, hey, this is what you are and what you'll always be, and that is part of it's very much like grooming in that respect, yeah. And these people, and there was one very sad story about this woman and her sister, where I would love to find this and let you and watch it because I saw the interview on this, and she was a little bit older than her sister and said that they were both groomed to be participants in this satanic rituals and stuff. Their father gave them, the father and mother were deep in this stuff. And she said, I tried to protect my my little sister, and I would let them do things to me and say, oh, I don't mess with her. She's not, I'll do it, kind of a thing. She was sacrificing herself for her sister. And she said one day they took her sister and she never saw her again. She said, I did everything I could to protect her, and she said, that really crushed me, to have that happen because I was trying to be her protector, and, so we know without a doubt that a lot of these children disappear into that because their families let them do that. They're being given into this, not just kidnapped and taken, but they're being bred for these purposes and all that. And that's a very sad fact. But it's all about the ritual stuff, the rituals, and they use vampires and werewolves in their different rituals and stuff to be not only enforcers, but they're almost like handlers in a way too. Vampires especially have handlers and people that protect them. And like that mother thing I was telling you about earlier, they got people in their cults that do that for them. They're the what they feed on. So they've got a system set up. You've got handlers, you've got feeders, you got the vampires themselves. You've got recruits. You got people coming into it from different ways. So it's all a networked system.
Yeah.
That's very dark. Yeah, dark and evil. Yeah.
Yeah. You have your universal, which is the highest level. Then you have your quadrant, international and in the United States, and your regional. And usually what you'll see is in, every quadrant, they're going to have a castle or a mansion that they're connected to. You have a lot of the older mansions or castles would actually have graveyards built right at the very bottom, like into the underground of that facility. And you'd have a lot of them using those underground family graveyards, where they're actually going to be sleeping in the graves. They teach the kids from a very young time how to get in and out of the graves, the catacombs. You have most of your quadrant areas will have, massive ritual grounds set up connected to catacombs, and they're going to know all those areas. They learn them from the time they're young. They have to learn them by complete memory in the dark, so they know how to get in and out of those areas.
Yeah. And I think a very important connection to all this, Jesse, is the fact that the demonic is drawn to places of the dead like a magnet. I mean, that's where they go. They gravitate, mortuaries, battlefields, wherever there's been trauma and all that. And I was telling somebody the other day, matter of fact, some of the most interesting places I run into the demonic has been in churches. They are in churches too, in places of the dead, places of religious aspects of things. There's a darker element there. And if, I've had a lot of people come to me over the years, let's go ghost hunting. We'll go in the cemetery and do some ghost hunting. I say, the only thing you're going to probably run into there are demons. That's where they hang out. And that's a very famous case of the demoniac in the Bible. Where was he at when Jesus encountered him? He was out among the tombs, And you see all this representation. You see the coffins and the represent skulls and representations of death mixed up in all these cults. That's where their power base is. We've got to understand a lot of this occultic power and the rituals and all this are geared to one thing and one thing only, tapping into the demonic for their power and everything that they use. That's one of their big things that they work with. And without a doubt, a lot of the rituals are geared to, and like you say, they're climbing a ladder. Mm-hmm. You know, they're going from step A to B, C, and on. And the higher up the ladder they get, the more powerful they become, the more gifts they are given by their father, the more things they can do. Yeah, and that's what they're working on that as well. It's not just maintaining the cult or the coven or whatever group, the gang or whatever you want to call it. It's not just maintaining it and assuring its safety and secrecy, because that's a big part of it, but also it is acquiring this power. And the more people involved, and you know this well, the more people involved in the ritual, whether you know you're involved or not, and that's the sad thing about it, you are still a participant. Yeah. You know, and in the ritual if you're not careful.
Yeah. And that's what they do. They draw people in. Like we'll see those big cathedrals that, you know, look like they've got all these pinnacles. They look like a massive catacomb. That's where you'll find, you know, those buildings are actually altars. And this is where a lot of them will congregate. Anywhere where you have massive connections to the dead, the underground graveyards, the catacombs. You're going to find a lot of vampire and werewolf collections in those areas.
You have a lot of people buried at the altar too. You know, you have people buried sometimes. Yeah.
And the structures of those buildings are the actual, you know, they'll call them the gates to hell. So wherever you see that structure for the gates to hell, you'll know you'll have vampires and werewolves as well. But in that, you know, you're going to get your higher level priests and priestesses who are engaged in the vampirism. They're going to attend those temples, attend those altars. You'll see some other things like we've talked about, like how they have the, I always forget what it's called, but the mantras, I think it is, where it looks like that big sunburst. That is representative of, goes with the pelican imagery. And for them, that also is a sign that there's vampirism in that place. Like wherever you see that mantras, you know, and they're going around, you know, like they'll go around and almost like, you know, try to make holy or bless, they'll call it. But you'll see them go around to the thresholds of different buildings or different gate entrances. And what they're doing with that is they do it as a sign publicly. So all their vampires and werewolves know that those are the places where they can come in or go out.
And, you know, look at all the death imagery in a lot of these churches. And you have a lot of people even buried at the thresholds of churches in some of these cathedrals. Yeah. And it's not a well-known fact, but whenever they laid the cornerstone of a church, they would sacrifice somebody, supposedly. They would put somebody's body in that cornerstone or bury them beneath that cornerstone as a sacrifice. You did this also with a dog, which is also known as the church grim. I'm sure you heard of them. You did that for the cemetery. You buried him in, I think, the northeast corner of the cemetery is where you sacrificed this dog, and he was the guardian of that cemetery. And so they believed in big time that you left these dead bodies or buried dead people there as guardians. Their spirits would remain as guardians over these places. Yeah.
The saints, and they'll call them the saints too. You know. Yeah. But they're really, you know, it's really the dead. It's really demonic spirits. It's, you know, you have people that are, I mean, it gets worse. We're just bringing out the light side of it, you know, the things that are easy to digest that they do, but it really is the
like I said, you know, the demonic is drawn to you know, things of death and destruction and bodies and all this other stuff, the catacombs. You see a lot. You see a lot of this representation in churches. They used to be, a lot of archaeologists and people that study these things would look at. I think they were called. They had a name for them, I think. But they had different faces in these churches that were very demonic looking. So you have a lot of imagery there, telling you that, hey, this is not just a place of God. This is sort of a intersection for these things to happen. And I think that's one reason why the demonic is drawn to churches and places like that, because it is sort of a spiritual crossroads kind of a thing. But also, it makes sense to put the enemy in your fortress. Yeah. That makes sense too when you think about it. Yeah, you have somebody on the side. There was a very famous preacher once said, "The devil goes to church every Sunday." And that's kind of true in a way. He wants to know, without a doubt, he wants to know what his enemy's up to. So he's got agents always on the inside. And I've heard this. I know you probably have too. That a lot of witches supposedly are given assignments over churches to cause as much problems as they can in certain churches and all. Yeah. And that's part of the coven work, as they call it. The work of the coven is to do these things, to antagonize their enemies.
Yeah. Well, what they do is these buildings, why do they desecrate the building? It's to make, it legal ground for them. Once there's unrighteousness, a murder, a death on it, once there's blood spilled, they now have legal ground to that territory. And they'll do it, in connection to the entire building. And they'll call these buildings living buildings. You'll see, like, even your grand mansions, it's like, how do they get all these gargoyles or these weird structures, these weird faces coming out of the marble or the different textures that are used in the building? It's because you've got that spiritual connection. You have actual demons that are manifesting just like they would with a person. Like, once there's an access point there,
like gargoyles.
Yeah, you'll have the manifestation of the spirits coming through as they begin to take territory. And you'll notice, like, certain times, like, it'll be coordinated where you'll have certain spirits in the building being witnessed at certain times. And that's part of that structure. They're taking authority because of that legal ground. Same with the grand churches. How did that structure get there? It's because of the spiritual connection that's there in that building, and because of the blood that's spilt there. I've brought out in some of my testimony how they, not only do they murder or kill people, they literally bury people alive. They will put blood in the material that's used to build these buildings, to desecrate it. They will put it on top of a water source, a wellspring, and they'll desecrate the whole wellspring for the area as well. So, you get a lot of different ways they're going to tackle claiming, what they're going to call legal ground in different areas. And the capstones, they'll bury stuff behind those. Usually they'll have some treasures as well, but, they do that to kind of make that their legal ground. Yeah.
And a lot of these older houses, mansions, and stuff like that. And I've looked for a few myself. I found a few over time. The witch marks that they always put in these houses, as signs of protection. They believed that a lot of this stuff was protection type thing too, that was going on. But when you look at the imagery in these churches, like the gargoyles, the spider webs, and all these things they put in there, it's very gothic. And gothic stuff is very dark. It is based a lot on vampirism and werewolfism and all that is deeply entrenched in the gothic lifestyle type thing. That's why a lot of these goth people, as they call a lot of these young people, get into this stuff. And they get into some of these vampire societies and all this other stuff because they're already predisposed to do that. But like you mentioned earlier, Jesse, it's very fact, like we said, they're trying to supplant the authority of God with their own authority in these places. That's what the whole thing is about. That's what the war is about. The war between good and evil a lot is this authority thing going on. They want their own authority to take precedence over anything else. And they want you to go along with that too. That's what their whole thing is, to give yourself over to that authority as well. And we got to remember, and I'm going to say there's a lot of gray areas in these places, but there is also the fact you've got the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light in this world. Mm-hmm. And it depends on which direction you're walking in is how things are going to go. And they know that. They understand these things. It's like what the Bible says, you believe in one God, you do well. Even the devils believe and tremble. Mm-hmm. The bad guys know all about this stuff. Okay, they know exactly, a lot of times more than what normal people know, because we don't think about these things. And they're steep deep in this history of these things, and they understand more about it than we do. Yeah, and that's where a lot of this symbolism, and I love to hear you talk about the symbolism of these things. It's very important. Their symbolism is their language. And like you're talking about a lot of these times that they wear the crystals, they use the crystals, they do these different things. Very much like us as Christians, we wear a cross or we have a sacred medallion or something, But I tell people a lot of times, and I warn them, that's not where your faith lies. Yeah. That's not where your true faith should be. They look upon their things. There's implements like the cards or the Ouija board or whatever the situation is. They look upon these objects as having a power themselves. The things that we wear, we should not trust in the power of them. We should trust in the power of our faith.
Yeah, God.
That's what we're putting. That's where we're putting our faith in, and we have to be very careful with that. They're going in the opposite direction from that in many ways, and that's the sort of, I call it the insidious part of witchcraft and all this stuff, because it's leading you away from what is really the true path, as we've always heard it called the left-hand path. They're going in the wrong direction, and they're going away from where the real truth lies. And that's what a lot of their stuff is geared for. To be misleading and misdirecting away from that. And that is why I say they're looking for their authority over things more so than the authority of God. If you look at the whole universe the way it's laid out, if you are a believer in that, you understand that the authority of God is what established everything in our existence. And you're going against that existence. You're going to have some bad results. And that's the way it works. But they're sort of swimming upstream with this, in that respect. So that's what a lot of their rituals and stuff are geared toward is getting away from the authority of God and giving authority over to the darkness to do these things with. That's where they get their power base from. That's what they're always seeking. And they're always seeking also to safeguard this stuff. They don't want you messing with it. They want to keep it where they want it. It's all about control. Big, big thing about control. Not only just about the reality around them. And that's what I've said about witchcraft. One very important thing you got to remember about witchcraft, it is the manipulation of reality. Mm-hmm. That's what you're doing. When you practice witchcraft, you're manipulating reality. That's like I've talked about these, African witch doctors that, take people's heads and they supposedly have power from them. They're taking reality one more step in many ways, and they're trying to change that reality from what it already is into something they want it to be. It's all about control. And what they're doing, though, unfortunately, when you do that, you're pushing God aside and saying, "Oh, God, I don't need you, God. I'll do this my own way." And unfortunately, that's a very dark spiritual way to look at things. But that's what they're doing, basically. That's what witchcraft and all that, and vampirism and all this thing. And, if you decide to become, we know there's certain ways to do this. You probably know this, how to perform and do these things to become a vampire or to become a werewolf or become a Black Panther if that's what you want to be or whatever this is. I'm not talking about the political movement either. I'm talking about the animal. I mean, if you want to do these things, you can do it, but it takes some very horrific things to do it, and you got to basically sell your soul in which to do it. So are you ready for the price that you got to pay for this stuff? Some people do. They don't care. I've actually had people come to me and tell me, "Please tell me how to become a werewolf. I want to be a werewolf." I said, "No, you don't. because it will swallow you up eventually. You won't be here anymore. You don't want to go that way. I'm not going. I'm. I know a lot of things about this stuff, and I know how to do this, but I'm not going to tell you because I don't want your soul blood on my hands. Exactly. I don't want to be answerable for that. Yeah.
But we can help people get out of that for sure.
Yeah, not in.
That's the
Jessie,
easy.
here's a question. Yeah, and obviously I know we've discussed this before on the show about a certain ex-president of the U.S., Bush Sr., who was well known to be a werewolf, and he was apparently his nickname was Timber or something like that as well. So what do you know about that? What can you tell us about that? And also, like, how did he become that? I mean, you were saying earlier on that at the age of 5, they go through rituals and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Maybe you can speak to us on that. What exactly is it that let's just talk werewolves for now, because I think werewolves and vampires are different, right? So I don't want to confuse the issue in my own mashed up brain right now, because all of this, as you know, just sometimes like, what the hell am I listening to here? Right.
Well, it's interesting.
The werewolf works off the beast within us all. That's what its basis is. And I'm going to see what Jesse thinks about this. But the werewolf is coming from that basis. The beast is in us all. There's an animal in all of us. We keep it suppressed. We keep it down. We keep it in its place. But if we turn it loose, it's like that old saying, there's a murderer in everybody. Under the right conditions, you will kill somebody very quickly. That's just us as human beings. We have that animal side of us, and that's what the werewolf hooks up to, that darkness. And I've said this a lot of times. We have an inherent darkness in all of us. That's our, as Lincoln said, that's the good and bad angels of our nature. Okay. And if that dark angel is connected to darkness from the outside, which is stronger than the darkness on the inside of us. Okay. If that darkness on the outside connects up with that darkness in us, it then has power. It has that authority. We give it that authority that I talked about earlier. It is able to take us over. So that's where the werewolf is coming from. It's coming from the bestial animal side of us that we have in us. But it is, and with all demonology type stuff, it is expanded greatly. It is magnified greatly by these forces. So a werewolf is an apex psychological psycho killer. That's what it is. If you turn a werewolf loose, if it gets your scent, it will not stop until it finds you and tears you into little pieces. That's just the way it works. Other things may touch you a break, but the werewolf is not going to do that. Mostly he always gets, that's why I've said this a lot of times in a lot of different podcasts and stuff. We don't have a whole lot of werewolf sightings reported because you never live through that to give a sighting. You don't usually come away from that. If you do, you are extremely lucky. God's really watching out for you, because the werewolf is going to get you. He's going to tear you into pieces and maybe even eat you just for the fun of it. That's just the way he's going to do, and he's probably not going to be hungry. He's just sort of like the final coup de grace. He's going to eat you. Yeah, that's the way it works. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and when we think about it too, like things I've shared about the system, we've talked about like degrees, and that plays a part with, the connection with the bushes and the werewolves. Mm-hmm. We know that the wolves are part of the protector system. We know, according to degrees, that, a lot of our past presidents were 33rd degree. But when you look at, the overall scheme, 33rd degrees, just small beans. What does that mean? That means that, for sure, for the fall and the spring equinox, and then, 2 of the other rituals, usually Halloween, Easter, or Christmas, they're going to have to show up. That's what that means, that 33rd degree. So the question then we need to ask is, really he's not the big beans in the pot. So who is he serving? Whose wolf was he? Whose protector was he? I think that's going to go back to, you have Barbara Bush. You also have other elites like the Clintons who were in their northern circles, all interconnected. And really, there's a guise like we see that a lot of our past presidents were big into hunting. A lot of our politicians were big into hunting. I brought out the connection with the Bushes and the Cheneys. They were all hunting buddies, along with a lot of your people who own islands, Epstein's, Branson. You get Ted Turner with CNN, all of those people being interconnected in these circle groups. But again, somebody that we think is in a position of high authority, really just being a pawn for the people that are really running the show behind the scenes. They're good at face fronts. They're good at the guys, and I think that that's what's really behind all that is, who is he serving? Who is he in place for? His position, why did they put him in these high level positions? Because it affords him then the ability to make ways for where they want to do things, to also provide the perimeter protections for, gives him a reason to be there with whoever he's going to be there with. And it's a cover. That's how they use those face front positions. So, nobody questions the president. Nobody questions why he's with certain people or where he wants to be. He can go wherever he wants to be internationally, connecting with other royals, other people during ritual times. So that's why they do that. But I would say yes, and we've brought out about a special adreno that they take, which is mixed with, other hormones from the body that enhances not only the spiritual effect, but when they take, they know how much to take to make themselves go into psychosis. And during, that psychosis they're unstoppable almost. It's really just completely favor and protection by God that keeps you safe, because as Dennis said, if they're intent on killing you, there isn't anything but the hand of God that's going to stop them, and really that's what you have is your authority, the rebuking the spirit, the casting out of the spirit, and standing in that authority is the only thing that is your protection. Your spiritual armor is enough. Your faith is enough. You don't need the cross. Stand in your faith and command and give that, stand in that authority, and they won't get anywhere. Remove that spirit from them. We have that full authority to do that, and to, break the chains of wickedness and that yoke of oppression that's over people.
And that's what I always say. That's called, spiritual armor. You got to have that spiritual armor on to face against this kind of darkness. Okay, you can't do it on your own alone. You got to have that full armor of God thing going on. If you don't, you're kind of sitting down. But you're talking about the Bushes and stuff like that with the skull and bones. I think is basically that was the organization of that, and they're supposed to swear allegiance on the. Supposed to be the skull of Geronimo, by the way, the Indian. Anyway, supposedly someone stole his skull out of his grave. I've been to Geronimo's grave. I often wondered, is that skull there? I like to know. But anyway, if you look at people like the Bushes, and I've had a lot of people come to me over the years and say, how can I tell a werewolf? What if my neighbor's a werewolf? I don't know, And the things that we're talking about here could be your best friend, you not know it. It could be somebody, in your Sunday school class or whatever. It could be a werewolf or a vampire, Yeah. Vampires walk in the daytime, my friends. They don't, we got to throw Hollywood out the door. When it comes to werewolves and vampires, Hollywood is useless. That's a bunch of made up stuff. Yeah. You got to go with folklore. Folklore is what tells you basically, the old wives' tales. They tell you some very important information on these things that you don't never need to discount that. But you got to understand that the werewolf by nature is evil on the inside. I want you to remember this, folks. Always remember this. Whatever darkness is on the inside of a person, it's going to show up outside somehow, sooner or later. And most of the time it shows up in the eyes or the movements or the very facial structure sometimes. I have actually seen people morph into these things. And with my own eyes, I have seen them go into some type of demonic looking creatures. And I'm not saying it's drastically like a Hollywood thing, but it's there. You can see it. You know what I'm saying? And it's a very, very interesting effect. Put it that way. And I'm being very light on that. It's very interesting. But actually, the eyes, if you look at somebody like George Bush or even his brother Jeb, and I'm going to tell you, Jeb looks like a werewolf to me, okay? They look at you very intently. They have that animal look. You know how a predator looks at you, you know? Jess, you might be walking through the parking lot of Walmart, and if you're scared and you're holding, you're clutching your pearls, and you're scared walking through there, the predator's going to look at you. There's a victim right there, you know, waiting to happen. But if you walk through that parking lot, staring them in the eyes, daring them to do something to you, they're going to probably leave you alone.
Yeah.
You know, most of the time.
A lot of them are in public service. Like, you know, like in coffee shops, in restaurants, and the hospital is a big place. You get a lot of your EMTs, firemen. Your wolves are very strong in smell. That's their, you know, they're going to know the moment you're walking in, they're going to know you're anointing and that you're anointed before you even walk through that door. They're going to know. And usually you'll see them, they'll find reasons to be in the background then, because they're trying not to have a confrontation. They don't want to mess with that anointing. So it's interesting. You know, you get hubs like Wyoming's a huge hub for your wolves. You get a lot of wolves in that area. Your Asheville, North Carolina, where Biltmore is, you get a lot of vampires. So you get a lot of different areas where people are. Yeah. And
you know, the female werewolf has an unusual amount of hair on her. And we kind of dismiss this with men, you know, maybe hair on her hands and all that. But if you see this supposedly on a woman with a more excess of hair, and I'm not just talking about on the legs, I'm talking about different areas of the body, you got to wonder about that too. But there's supposed to be different signs, but I always say the best one is that eye contact thing that's going on, that bestial look about them, and and you have that, and we call it an animal magnetism thing going on here. Mm-hmm. If you feel that being, you know, very expounded by certain people, you got to wonder about that, because that may be, like I said, that darkness on the inside. Sooner or later, somehow or another, always shows up on the outside. They can't control it that long. Eventually, it's going to show up. I mean, you know, you hear a lot about people with reptilian eyes, and you're seeing these different things and all that. That's demonic, folks. That's definitely demonic kind of thing.
Yeah,
that's going on there.
Spirits, yeah. I think for the wolves, like you'll also get, I think you get a couple different kinds, because a lot of times you'll have a connection with the Illuminati for the wolves, whether the Italian or the Russian. You'll get both those kind of blends. You'll also get Ukrainian, which is completely different, and
Romanian.
The Romanian as well. Those cultures tend to have more of a wolf congregation versus like your vampires a lot will come out of the French. You will get some with the Italian as well, but you'll get more your French, your German, some of those. But you can get, you know, a blend in each of them. But then you also get your bears, which we don't talk about the years that much either, but you get your whole...
well, that was, you know, with the Vikings, Jesse, you know, the Uthindar, and the Berserkers. The bears and the wolves warriors, and you have the Dacian wolf warriors. That's in Romania. The Dacian wolf. You have these stories of people turning into these things on the battlefield.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, they put most of them now in data centers. I hate to be the one to break that, but most of your bears work in data centers. and they just, it's a behind the computer type job. They kind of just zone out. Unless they're at war, they're very peaceful. But, if you're on their bad side, those bears are going to come out. But you get, different cultures that are training based on that because of their family contracts. And your females are worse than your males. A lot of times, your females are going to kind of be very protective about the whole pack. Before we get too far, Chanti, I also want to show that website because you can know in your areas where a lot of the underground hubs are going to be. And I want to show this resource that we put up also in the chat. But this is your vampire network. Now you will have some of your wolves' dens that will be close to these facilities. But if you hear that term den, and you'll hear it a couple different ways, but you'll get connections directly with your wolf dens and your Ku Klux Klan building kind of in the same facilities. But this is the vampirewebsite.net. This is a real website run by the top 2 vampires in the world, Father Sebastian and Murdercus X. And go to the part like on the right side where it shows all the countries. You get on it when you go to it, you'll get where it shows the countries there on the right. Go to the US first. Let's go down to the United States just so people can see what that will look like. So when you click on the United States, another map will show up showing all the different states. And when you click on those, go ahead and click on Minnesota there. When you click on the state, go up, like up. You'll see the MN. There you go. When you click on the state, it then will bring up all the, and we'll see if it'll let us internationally. There it is. So see on the right side or the left side now, it shows Minneapolis. Now it used to be you had 5 different areas Minnesota was broken down into, and you'd have about 5 or 6 clubs in each area. But as you can see, a lot of the vampire networks and clubs have been closing down. But if you click on it, it will actually give you the address and the names of the clubs. You can use this in your prayer strategy. I don't encourage you to go down, like to actually go into the club, all anointed, because you'll be declaring war. And that's what you're going to find yourself in, is a war. But you can walk vicinity wise, if you know about where it is, walk around the block, pray, anointed, ask the Lord to bring people out of that darkness. You can also use this to watch in the area. If you watch these clubs around ritual times, you'll start to see that they begin to have information. They'll put up special things that can give you ideas as to where the rituals are going to be happening within that region. Go ahead back to click back to where it goes to countries and go to South Africa there. The same thing internationally, you can look up by country. And if you don't see anything coming up, that means that area, all the underground clubs have been shut down now. We see for Africa, South Africa, the only place showing up is Cape Town. So that's really great news too. And that's what you're going to find. A lot of these, some states now have no vampire clubs in them. So this is a huge work the Lord's been doing to shut a lot of these down. So again, when you click on it, you'll have the clubs pop up, if there are any, but it's a really good resource. Use it in your prayer strategy. Use it strategically in intercession. Use it to figure out where they're doing stuff and where they're congregating. because they do have their routes. They do have areas they're going to protect and go through. But slowly but surely, all these have been closing down. So that's a good thing. Yeah, thanks for showing that. I just wanted people to have that resource and to know how to use that properly.
Cape Town.
Yeah.
I'm still spinning from the vamps in Cape Town. I want to know how many of those I've come across in my life.
Yep. Right.
Wild. Wow.
It would be a good idea never to eat or drink anything while you're there. Definitely.
Yeah,
I would
don't
advise against that.
That's one of the biggest ways but yet at the same time, I have to put out there, a common way they're going to lure you is they offer you something, whether it's a gift, food, they're going to offer and share something with you. If you don't take it, you're now declaring war. You may be their enemy. But if you do take it, that gives them access to do whatever. So my motto is you receive it graciously, but you also remove any permission or authority. Thank you. I will share this with you, but this does not mean I'm giving you any permission or authority over me. I receive this as, a gracious gift, and that's where it starts and ends. That does work. I have done that. You'll get the same thing with your elite. They'll always offer food. And if you don't receive food or drinks or what they're offering you, after you leave, you'll get all the weather witchery, the tornadoes dropping right in your path, the lightning strikes coming through your windows, So just receive, but at the same time, remove all permission and authority. But
there's a reason why your mother and father always used to tell you, don't take things from strangers. Once you accept something, whatever it is, whatever intention is behind it, it belongs to you. Yeah. Then, okay, yeah, it's very important you realize that spiritually and physically, it belongs to you. And you got to be very, and the thing about witchcraft and all that, and I was telling somebody this the other day, it's very interesting, that one of the big powers of witchcraft is manipulation of weather, by the way. Yeah.
And you'll see that used even with your vampires, your wolves, like the storms before they come in. You'll see like the dark clouds, the weather changing. The wolves tend to have a lot of fog.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So if you see that coming out of nowhere, the best thing is just immediately pray, stand in your authority, put on your armor, rebuke, and cast out anything that's coming through that area, and just say, I don't give you permission or authority. I'm removing that, and I am claiming my authority to pass through in peace.
That's very important, That's very important what you said about that authority. We must walk in authority, talk in authority. We got to be very careful. We don't want to authorize some of these things by the very things that we say. We got to understand it's not, we don't want to be like Job, who all through the book of Job, he keeps saying, that what I greatly feared has come upon me. You're sort of authorizing that, you don't want to do that. Yeah. So we got to be very careful what we say, and how we deal with these things, because they're looking for that one little opportunity. You got to remember one thing about the demonic, whatever form it may come in, whether it's a werewolf, vampire, whatever it is an opportunist. It's looking for an opportunity to get in your life somehow or another. It's going to stick the foot in your door if you crack that door open just a little bit, okay? Sometimes that's what they used to say. Sometimes the devil gets one toe in the door there. He's going to get in, Yeah, so you got to be very careful.
Yeah, so many of them now are in support service roles, because then you are willingly receiving and not even knowing. Like if they're serving you at a restaurant, you're receiving that meal, not even thinking twice, because you've gone there to eat and enjoy a meal. you know, you don't even think about that. Or in the hospital, you're there for help. You don't even think about that the care you're receiving or that's being provided to you may come with other things, you know. And even your willing consent to give blood or to receive a medication or to receive a drink, you know, you don't even double think that. When you go to church, many of them will be put in usher positions where they're serving the communion, the wine and the bread. And that's where they get the willing consent, because you are participating willingly, not even double thinking, oh my gosh, there's something else behind this. But it doesn't mean everybody serving communion is going to be involved in these things. But this is some of the ways that they get in there that you think, you know, you don't even think that you need to protect yourself. But trust the leading of the Holy Spirit. You know, I usually will just say, Lord, if I'm going in somewhere, if there's permissions that somebody's trying to get that I may not be aware of, would you just prompt me in my spirit to pray? You know, like we went to one restaurant once where it was at first the girl at the head hostess, and I just right away it was like wolf. You know, like that's how it is in my head. It's like wolf. It's like, okay, she's a wolf. And then I started to realize like another guy came in behind her looking at his schedule, kind of looking over her shoulder. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. He's a wolf too. Then as we sat down, I kid you not, I started to realize every single server in that restaurant was a wolf. It was like, oh boy, Lord, will you get us out of here? Because yeah, we've got a bunch of wolves in here, you know, but
werewolves may even have their own soulmates. There you go. Okay, but that's interesting. You know, and I heard one time about a witch complaining to another witch. You know, it was her, you know, the mother witch that she was talking to. Said, you know, I was doing spells the other day, and they were bouncing off of this person. You know, I couldn't. What was I doing wrong? She said, "It's not your fault. That's a praying person. Leave them alone." That's the way it goes. Yeah. So if we're walking around in this armor of God, you know, you ain't got a whole lot to worry about in that fact. If you keep that armor, but you got to keep that armor spotless and clean and strong. Yeah. If you don't want it to rust, and you don't want little chinks in it, because that's what the enemy's looking for. They're always looking for a way in past that armor. You know, a lot of people worry about that. Oh, you know, this is another thing for me to worry about. You know, witches. Why do I have to worry about witches? But that's just part of the whole makeup of the what I would say the evil underworld around us, or whatever name you want to give it. It's all part of the World Wide Web of witchcraft. And I want to tell you something, Jess. Now, you may agree with this or not. But in my recent research, I've been doing a lot on this stuff because I'm writing a book on some of this you know, connected with some of this stuff. I have been very astounded by the rise in witchcraft in this world, rising more now than ever before in the history of mankind. And
invisible.
Yeah, and it's coming in so many different forms. Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, and you do get, you know, you get your vampires and your wolves engaging in different forms of witchcraft, usually always going back to your Solomonic, your Enochian magic, and your different forms of magic that engage in the blood magic. So your upper levels, your Solomonic and Enochian are the biggest ones for blood magic. You also get like your Gaoshin, some of your Thelemic magic. You'll get different forms. And as sad as it is, like, you know, I don't even know how to put some of the stuff into words, but they have gotten creative in their ways to gather blood. Not always, you know, killing nowadays. Like I was bringing out on one of my shows how they were doing it in California. And making it almost like it's policy or procedure. So in some of your school systems now, your elementary schools, California was one of the first that put it out. They were requiring, saying, oh, little boys get periods too. And they started making it a requirement that the school teach little boys how to use feminine products. Well, here's the thing. When we don't know better, right? We're like, well, this is crazy liberal stuff. It's not. Like, it's not just crazy liberal stuff. There's more behind it. That becomes one of the ways that then when they're harming these little boys, there's only one way little boys are going to be bleeding. It's because they're, being victimized, they're being raped. And this is their way of covering that, making it seem like it's a normal thing that happens once a month to these boys. And then they gather the feminine products with the blood on it afterwards as well. And this is one of the ways they get willing blood, and they make it part of the school system, which then gives them a legal right to it. Yeah. They did the same thing now with kids that they claim to be furries. That's another big movement where kids are sexually identifying as animals, and they started putting kitty litter boxes in the bathrooms. And that's another way that they're gathering that blood, is through the kitty litter. So these are things we need to be aware of,
That, Baphomet that you mentioned earlier, which is a big witchcraft symbol. He's a tranny, by the way, if you look at him. Okay. Yeah. And this is nothing but a form of indoctrination and programming. Exactly. That's what it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And getting kids to just, they put a form of godliness, something that seems innocent, like, pretending to be an animal or identifying as an animal. They make it all cute, make it acceptable, especially like with your anime. There's a huge connection between those things and the anime. And people are willingly embracing that, not even knowing the darker agenda behind it. But we have to not be blind to those things, because this is part of how they've gotten away with it for so long in our communities and our areas. It's time that we remove that authority of those who are occultically, engaging in our quadrants and our regions and taking our authority and our rights away from us and our children. When we just in prayer remove that authority, there's nothing they can do, and when we anoint, when we pray, when we ask, for the restoration of that authority to its proper places, the Lord says he'll drive them out of those areas. He says, when you tear up the strongholds, then
as a minister, I advise people that when you do exercise this authority, you must do it in a commanding way. You don't just say, please do this. You don't do it. You command. You use the use of authority means that you believe in that authority, that you have that, you grasp that authority and use it that way. If I put you in charge of a whole company, then you have the authority over that company. And even the demonic, we must remember, it's very important that people realize this. And I counsel people all over the world about this. There's two keys you got to take when it comes to the demonic, and that's what we're talking about today, whether you're coming in the form of werewolf, vampire, witch, and most of the time werewolves and vampires are witches, okay? That's the way that goes. Whatever you're coming from in this way, you got to remember this is demonic stuff, okay? And the demonic, there's two big keys that we got to look at. With the demonic, you got to remember, the demonic is coming from darkness. Okay, it's which is the opposite of light, and all the kingdom of darkness I talked about earlier. That's where its base is, and you got to understand that things that are connected to that are coming from that direction. Okay, but another key of the demonic, and I tell this to people, is you got to remember this. Here's where the authority lies. The demonic has absolutely no power over you unless you give it to them. That's where the authority comes in. Don't give them power. Don't give them authority over you. Don't give them that leg up in the saddle on you, or they'll ride off with your horse. Okay? That's what you got to look at. And you got to remember that when you exercise authority, you got to believe in that authority. That's God, by the way, folks. That's where that authority is coming from. If you don't do it that way, it's not going to work for you. I've had people I would tell people a lot of times they've got a problem in their house. You know, I say, you need to speak to these things and tell it, get out of here. Get out of my house. God's given me authority here. You get out of here. You can't belong here. You don't stand up and say, would you please leave? Please. You don't do that. That's not using authority. You got to get up there and command it. Yeah. Yeah.
Get on out. That's usually my next phrase. Get on out of here.
Yeah.
Super interesting, guys. What a great show. And we kind of hit like hour and a half already, or just about. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been very, very informative.
I think we put a little crack in the tip of that iceberg. I think a little bit anyway.
Yeah, just a little one.
Yeah.
Jess, is there anything you would like to say just in ending, rounding up from your side, and obviously where any shows you're doing, where people can find you this week, and any announcements you'd like to make?
Yeah, you can find me on kingdomlivingwithjessie.com as well as on patreon.com/Jessie Czebotar. I encourage you to find out more. I do a lot of the coachings, land assignments 1 through 4, where I really teach and break down how to recognize the symbols regionally. In my international land assignments, I begin to speak about how to recognize their symbols internationally and how they mark territories. You can know by looking at the city sigil and by the coat of arms, if there's vampires or werewolves in the area. A lot of that will be marked on those territorial signs, as well as in connection to your school systems. So, if you want to find out more, I encourage you to look for those coachings. I have ones coming up here in February, and you can register for those on my website.
Wonderful.
And you can find me over at my YouTube podcast channel and agency, which is called Hunting the Shadows. That's on YouTube. And if you want to contact me, like I said, I have a paranormal consultation service. If you need to talk to me, ask questions, you got concerns or whatever, or just want to tell me your story, you can contact me at denniswcarroll.com or denniswcarroll@gmail.com. Also, come on over to the network, to the channel, and join up. And we would love to have you participate and watch some of our interesting shows that we have. Also, my books are available on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. Look up the author as Dennis W. Carroll.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Joanne, thank you so, so much for your very generous super sticker. I'm trying to pop it on the front, but I don't think it can pop up. Why is it not coming up onto the screen? Thank you, Joanne. I really, really, really appreciate you. And thank you, everybody, for watching and enjoying. And we'll definitely have Dennis and Jessie back on again. I think there's a lot of topics you guys could blend energies on. And yeah, really, I think it's great to have the two of you conversing. And yeah, very good. So thank you. Definitely look forward to more of these in the future as well. Thank you, everybody. Take good care of yourselves. I will see you tomorrow, and not the weekend, but tomorrow, yes. And I'll see you then. And in the meantime, stay cool, stay safe, stay sweet, stay sassy. Yes, see you later. Mwah.